Hi everybody. I wanted to take a few minutes and review with you some of Chapter 14, some tips and tricks to help you get through it. Honestly, this is, for me, one of the hardest chapters in the entire book, and really definitely probably the hardest chapter in this semester. It's very conceptual, and there's a lot in it that you can't see, touch, and feel. It's mostly processes. So this is where we understand the anatomy of the nervous system with the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, the brain, and the cranial nerves. And now we're getting into how all of that interacts, right? How do we get those sensations into the brain and then out into motor pathways? And you can think of these nerve fibers as little strings, little highways coming in and out of your brain and up and down the spinal cord, and all of those different pathways have a special purpose. So in other words, if it's this particular sensation, it's going to travel on this particular pathway to this part of the brain, and if it's a different sensation, it's going to go on this particular pathway to this part of the brain. And that's really what this chapter is all about, understanding the different pathways and how your brain organizes and sorts that information for some type of output. So you get a classification of the senses there on page 462, looking at all of the different senses and what receives, what those receptors are. In other words, how are they activated? How are those senses activated? And how are they responded? What's the response? Sorry, I was having trouble finding my words there. Then on page 463, you get a nice graphic organizer looking at the different types of senses. You have the somatic senses and the visceral senses that you're not really aware of, and then of course the special senses, which we have a whole chapter on later on. So this chapter is really on those general senses, not the specific senses like vision and olfactory. You get into, on page 464, all of the different types of receptors that you have for general sensory receptors that are throughout the body, such as muscle positioning, whether or not touch, light touch, deep touch, vibration, pain, all of those types of receptors are described there for you. There's some little tests that you can do, and I'm sure you'll have fun with this in lab once you get there. And then you get to page 466, where you actually have a process diagrammed out for you on how the nerves are transpiring or sending these signals, and this has to do with their orientation and how those gated channels are activated. So that's what that little diagram there is for. I strongly suggest taking the note cards, putting each step on a note card, seeing if you can swish them around and put them in order. It's a great way to learn that activity or learn that process there. The table on page 468 is a table summarizing some of those different pathways that I was alluding to, like the anterolateral pathway, the dorsal column, spinocerebellar pathway. Those are all different routes in and out of the brain, looking at the types of input and the types of output and where that travels. Do you have to know everything on that chart? No. Like the primary cell body and secondary cell body, where those junctions are? No. For the most part, a lot of them are synapsing in the dorsal root ganglion, because that's the major kind of cross-section there. But you don't have to know where the crossover occurs either, if it's going to the opposite side of the brain or if it just stays straight on the same route. But you should be familiar with what types of information those pathways are bringing. So in other words, the fact that the anterior spinocerebellar tract is bringing in information about body position. That's important to know. But is it important to know that it crosses, maybe it recrosses at the cerebellum? No, that's not important. You don't have to know the point of crossing or the side of the body where those fibers terminate. All of those specific details, no, just the general big picture, what it does, why it's important. That's really all you need to know from that. And that's like what's diagrammed out in that little picture there, figure 14.8. It's showing you those free nerve endings and how that information travels up into the brain as it passes through the brain stem and up into the higher levels. You see that similar drawing there, figure 14.9 and 14.10 of different pathways. Just again showing you how these nerve fibers are getting information to different parts of the brain and how that's going to be decoded and then responded to. You should be familiar with the functional regions of the brain, the different parts of the brain, and we went over the anatomy of the brain in the last couple of chapters, but this is overall functions. In other words, where the motor centers are, where the sensory centers are, the different special sensory areas of the brain, the visual cortex, etc., all the different cortices that are involved with our special senses, as well as some of the general senses, all diagrammed out there on page 471. That's important to understand, and you'll probably be tested on that in lab. I won't give you pictures in lecture, but it's important to know what those areas do. There's a big section on pain, referred pain versus phantom pain and chronic pain. The different pain sensations are important to understand, that throbbing pain, aching pain versus the burning or sharp pain. They activate different nerve fibers, and so they're going to be responded to differently in our brain. What's the next couple of sections here? Controlling the skeletal muscles. You don't have to know those homunculi that are diagrammed out there, 474 and 475, where all of the different parts of the body are on the motor or sensory cortex. That's not important, at least for lecture purposes. It's not important. But it's important to understand what it is. That it's basically, if someone were to cut your brain open and to look at that one part of your brain, that's where, your big foot sensory information is, etc. Then you get to page 470, and there's another pathway diagrammed out there for the corticospinal, rubrospinal, vestibular-spinal, all the different pathways going in and out of the brain for the spinal pathways instead of the cortical pathways. Cortical pathways are going up to the cortex. These are just the spinal pathways. These are just relayed at a lower level without involving your consciousness. And so again, those are important pathways to understand, just the general sense of those. You get descending pathways, direct pathways, and indirect pathways diagrammed out for you on page 478 and 479. I think flowcharting these out, or maybe even trying to redraw them and make sense of them in some way. Everyone learns differently, so whether you're actually taking this and summarizing it, reading the caption and seeing if you can rephrase it, redrawing it, or flowcharting it out in some way, any way you can grasp your brain around this other than just staring at it, because when you just stare at it, you're going to fall asleep. Finally, getting into some modifying and refining of the motor activities, all done through the basal nuclei and parts of the cerebellum, which are important for balance. Then getting into brainstem functions, and a little bit into some special functions like speech and higher brain functions, communication, where that communication is heard, and the different parts of communication. It's not just hearing the sounds and saying, oh, well, there's a sound, but actually understanding what those sounds mean, analyzing those sounds together to put the words or the ideas together, the logic or whatever, and then being able to formulate some type of response. It's a very complicated process that we take for granted. So it's kind of interesting to look at all of that, as well as right brain versus left brain in that little clinical impact on hemisphere dominance. And then there's a little case study there on multiple sclerosis, MS, and looking at EEGs, the different waves of the brain, the different energies that our brain gives off. That's important. We pretty much covered the cellular mechanisms and action potentials in previous chapters, but you'll see it diagrammed out again for you on figure 14.23. So if you didn't get it before, make sure you get it now. And I think that's it. Then you get into aging, some effects like Alzheimer's, sleep, and memory. And the last little section is on stroke and how stroke can obviously impact our entire body, not just our brains. Very important to understand that. There's a list of central nervous system disorders, table 14.5 on page 494. You should be familiar with those in terms of what they are. So please let me know if you guys have any questions, and keep up the hard work. Bye-bye.